Okay, well, good afternoon. I'm guessing you must be really, really keen on BIM and this topic because it's Friday afternoon, it's freezing cold, and we're in Brussels, probably a long way from home. So, come on, let's push on through. Okay, well, great to see you all. And what I'm going to be talking about is really the drivers for change. We've heard from Lars and from Irvind and from Ian about the driver for competitiveness and standardization and thinking about how we do this as a common practice. What I'm going to talk about is how governments, and particularly European governments, Brexit aside, are pushing for this, are really encouraging it and driving it, really making a lot of this conversation inevitable. It's just a matter of time, I think, before we see this spreading across Europe. So, without further ado, I'm going to focus on the top circle, which is around what is the government conversation, what are public policymakers around Europe in governments and public procurers doing to help take their role and take their position in terms of encouraging this and accelerating the adoption in a standardized way across Europe. So, I'm going to talk about who we are as a group. That is the EU BIM Task Group. What is our objectives? Why are we working together? What are the drivers that we see? And why are we taking this position to encourage BIM in public procurement and across Europe? First of all, as a scene set, a number of you, I recognise a lot of the country names that are around our table. You may be aware of others as well. These are just some of the national programs that exist around Europe. Europe is, without doubt, the greatest region, the greatest area around the world that has a concentration of governments and public sector bodies pushing for this in different ways. In France, there's a different style program, perhaps to the UK, as you would naturally expect, perhaps. And Germany is different as well, but there are some common themes. And I'm going to talk about what those common themes are today. I'm going to talk about how we've recognised that if we go off with a different strategy, all doing our own different thing around Europe, that won't help. It will actually create confusion. It will create barriers for us to work across those markets. Ian described right at the beginning around competitiveness. So we want to drive for competitiveness. We want to drive and encourage productivity. So why we're collaborating is to accelerate national efforts in order to create alignment across Europe, minimizing the costs for the change to BIM, this digitalization transition. If we can minimize that and do it in a standardized way as described by Irvind, and touched on by Lars as well, and I'll come back to that in a bit, then we have the opportunity to create an open market across Europe where we're able to trade, obviously, with the same definitions, understand the same language in tenders and in contracts. I would add a further point, which I think was picked up by both Irvind and Lars, is that by collecting together public procurers with one single vision and definition for BIM, we actually have an ability to create critical mass and a way to influence standardization and international standards efforts, but also the technology providers as well, and other suppliers in that conversation. So it has a lot of advantages. In the very short space of time that I've got with you now, I'm going to describe two models that are also described in the handbook. Now I'm going to do a bit of pass the parcel, so I'm going to ask Luciano if you could pass the handbook down that's under my pad of notes. I'll also just wave that at you, or even just ask Irvin to, oh there we go, thank you. This is like a Christmas game, isn't it? And I unwrap it. So we have described in this handbook two models for public procurers, but also for industry to recognise a consistent approach. The first is a strategic approach in terms of the general strategy for change in terms of a country view of how a country can adopt this as a program. And then secondly, and I'll go through that in a moment, and second model we've described in the handbook is about an organizing principle for how we define BIM at a project level, an organization level, and a country level. That's a really interesting idea, isn't it? That we could have a single definition that traverses those three different scales, that relies on this wheel that we're showing here. And it's a way of bringing some of what Irvin described and what Lars touched on, is bringing together this collective view of describing BIM from a documentation largely perspective in terms of legal side, legal issues, skills issues on the left-hand side, and at the bottom, the technical aspects, data and process issues. So using that framework and using those two models I've just touched on, this is the group. Now, the group is comprised of 23 countries currently. We got together with Norway about 3 years ago with Irvind and Diderik. This was the UK, and said, what about we just bring together a couple of people around Europe to see if there's interest at a country level, at a government level, in collaborating. And what was interesting to us was we got about 10, 12 countries first of all, and that rapidly has grown over 3 years, with the Commission support, I should add, to 23 countries. And a lot of those I recognise here as well. I should stress that this is a public sector network, so it's either public procurers, public estate owners, building owners, infrastructure owners, a really good mix actually of infrastructure owners as well as buildings. It's not just all about the building side. We created a shared vision. So what are we trying to achieve? I've already touched on it, that the public sector interest is around creating competitiveness, the word that Ian described there earlier, openness, a fair market, but increasingly this is about driving value for money. We can't hide away from that. That is very much one of our key drivers, is to get greater value for public money by stimulating innovation, principally in this idea we call digital construction. Now, BIM has a value proposition for the public sector, for the private sector, and thirdly, for the built environment. And we describe it in this way, in economic, environmental, and social ways. We're a huge market in Europe. I'm sure there are slightly different numbers depending on whose you use, but it's all in the ballpark of about €1 trillion. It's a huge market, employs 18 million people, 3 million organisations. 95% are less than 20 employees classified as SMEs. So it's an incredibly diverse and fragmented market. I'm sure that's nothing that you're not already aware of. But what's interesting is BCG, that's the Boston Consulting Group, recently identified the global savings from the digitalization of the sector. Well, first of all, they recognize that it's inevitable. Secondly, they forecast by 2025, digitalization would drive a benefit of between 13 to 21%. Now, that's just in the delivery phase, in the capital phase. If we saved 10% in Europe, which is broadly aligned with actually what the UK strove to drive in terms of savings, that would be about 120 billion euros a year. So clearly it's a large prize and one worth going for as a region. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just so you know, there's a lot of diversity in the group. We have a steering group. We have an ability to make decisions collectively, consulting with a wider group. Just as we are here, we have, I think, about 7 translators typically in our General Assembly sessions, 23 countries, diversity in our steering group, which includes smaller economies, large economies, east and west, north and south, and so on. We've done some work to engage with industry, to communicate our mission, to spread the word, to drive awareness of this as an inevitable transition for the sector. And we'll continue to do events like this. And thank you to ACE in particular for the invitation today to speak to you. We're also defining, this is the bit that touches now on Lars and what Irvin said. So we're defining this common definition. I showed this earlier. It's a way of collecting all of the physical stuff, all of the artifacts that define what BIM is, and to agree the principles at a European level. So when at national level we're defining things, they apply to a higher set of principles. That's the thinking behind this handbook and behind our group, is that we create commonality and alignment in order to reduce confusion, reduce waste, and allow us to work across different countries. So as an illustration, I'll use two examples of this. There's a lot more information, obviously, in the handbook and on the website. We wanted to look at, Lars touched on this in the working group that you've set up around obligations of the employer. An employer can't, or certainly shouldn't, just simply ask for just BIM in the contract. They should think about what information they need. They should think about the roles, the obligations of the delivery team, design team, and specifically it touches upon recommendations for intellectual property liability as well, which I noted in the working group discussion. So those are recommendations that we're making as a public sector organisation, as a network of public sector organisations, shall I say more carefully, and we are looking to encourage those in our contracts. So this goes to the drivers for change that I'm trying to make to you really clearly, is that increasingly we want to see and encourage our clients, certainly on the public sector side, to adopt a similar approach when they're describing BIM in tenders and also in the contracts, using these recommendations that we've set out. There's more detail, I should say. It's not just those 4 bullet points. Similarly, I'm going to pick up and use the second example here to turn to what Irvin was talking about in terms of standards. Really, if you haven't, I suspect you have, but really encourage you to take a look at some of the work in CEN and also ISO, specifically around these terminology definitions of employers' information requirements. What is the client asking for? That's how we tend to think of BIM as a process, as in terms of delivering information. It's a process to deliver information around the project and around the stakeholders, specifically including the client. So these are, I'm not going to go through these, but just to be aware that these are all, again, really clearly laid out in our handbook, and I hope the aspiration is that they help provide some clarity and guidance to the work that's going on in the standardization piece. One of the areas that we recognise is really important, but probably underserved, is, and I'm not sure I saw it in the earlier two, but certainly something that Ian touched on, is around skills. This is very much about upskilling an entire industry of, broadly 18 million people, but of course less than that in professional services. So giving clarity about what skills are required, what competencies particularly for those different types of roles is really useful. So we've got some recommendations in there as well in the handbook. And ultimately, where we're going now on our journey is that we've reached the first milestone that the Commission provided funding to help us get there, which is to develop a handbook, a single definition for the whole of the European public sector. It will be translated into 23 languages. I think it's about a third of the way through that process of translation currently. In fact, Ian and I were talking earlier that we'll potentially be able to share some of those with you, or printed copies and so on when they become available. And it includes those two models that we talked about at the strategic level and at the project level. Just a quick word in terms of our future direction. The model in terms of how this works is to go from the centre to the outside. So in the phase 2, we're naturally going to continue to push out, do more communication, increase our public leadership in terms of understanding how we drive this transition of the construction economy towards digital in a progressive way to allow the industry to adapt and adopt. But also help and support some of the standardization efforts on the right-hand side of this, with a view to increasing capacity through projects. Quite a lot wrapped up in a very short period then, but I think I would like to urge you and encourage you to recognise this is broadly accelerating efforts from a national perspective. We in Europe critically have a super concentration of effort and mindshare about this. I think that I would really urge you and encourage you to take advantage and seize that opportunity. Thank you very much.